Okay. Hi, Molly. Welcome to the Explorer Poet Podcast.
Hello, it's nice to be here with you. Very, very excited, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, me too. Genuinely excited. I've been listening to your podcast for a couple of years now, maybe at least 2 years, and just to say, like, I'm a genuine fan, and I think that a lot of the stuff that you put out there has been really, I think it's been really helpful for me personally. So I can speak to that, like anecdotally, I guess. If I'm a sample size of one, then yeah, like your podcast, genuinely, you came along, kind of appeared in my Spotify feed or however you popped up, but you were this kind of calm, rational voice who was talking about things in a way that I hadn't encountered. And it just happened to be during a time in my life where like I was kind of doing that thing where I was going off the rails and trying to figure out everything for myself. And so it was good timing, like really helpful. And I want to get into all sorts of stuff about, the way that you think about families and mental health and development and all this stuff. But before we do that, I'm just really curious, being somebody who's doing this myself, like putting out into the public sphere these ideas that I'm pursuing or trying to figure out. Just for you as a podcaster, as a writer, why the public, like why do it in public? Why approach your own mental health in such a public way?
I think the reason why I approach it in the way that I have is because for so long I felt like I was like screaming to feel heard in my own life. And I also have some murky, traumatic history in the music industry where, that's why I know how to record and edit audio, is because my first passion was songwriting. And I would edit all my own demos and stuff like that and send them out to producers. And I experienced some really traumatic stuff in the industry, kind of having, it's a tale as old as time. Just imagine the worst crap that could happen to a girl in the music industry. And that happened to me. I had my master's taken away essentially when I wouldn't, acquiesce to some shady sexual stuff with people in the industry. And interestingly enough, one of the producers that I was working with is actually one of the people that just sued Sean Combs. And I got out of all of that. Thankfully, my spidey senses saved me. I sensed there was some weird shit going on. And when I reported it, not only did my manager drop me, my producer dropped me, and my lawyer all dropped me at once. And I lost all the music that I'd been working for months and months on. And so I know what it feels like to kind of not have your voice. And so when I first started thinking about doing my podcast, what attracted me was that with RSS, right, with the technology of podcasts, it's kind of like pirate radio. Like no one can take my podcast feed away from me. I can edit all my own episodes. I can say what I want. And it was just liberating feeling. A little scary because I obviously talk about my own background, and my family is still alive. A lot of authors that I know that talk about their upbringing, it's almost like they wait till they're a lot older and then maybe their parents are no longer around. And so I'm not going to lie, it's difficult because I try my best to strike a balance to be respectful to my parents, who I do love very much. And I know that they were doing the best with what they had. And there's so much trauma in my family. And then also having my voice. So striking that balance is difficult. And I think I do a good job of it. But I'm not going to lie, it's obviously caused some issues in my family. And if I put myself in my parents' shoes, I think it would be difficult for me to hear some of it too. So it's hard, but at the end of the day, it's more important to speak out about these things, because I think we got ourselves into this collective mess by too many people not saying anything, right? So I think it's the highest form of love that we can offer everyone, to just speak candidly about these things, grounded in not blaming parents, not shaming people, understanding that hurt people, and really exploring the root causes rather than shining a light on one specific person. So I try to achieve that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why your podcast stood out to me in general, because it wasn't, it was a podcast that was like, I've had some really shitty experiences. I've struggled with some things that I've tried to communicate with people and they blame me for them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you weren't like looking for somebody to blame. You weren't looking to be like, it's your fault, mom, it's your fault, dad, it's your fault, whatever. I think that you went about it in such a way that it was like this genuine search for truth. And I think that's what you're talking about, like this, just being honest in public, honest about everything. It feels like, for somebody who's tried to do it myself, it feels like the only path forward for all of these problems that we have all across the world, both like, on our own individual, small scale, personal, like these things that Josh deals with. And then also these things that the United States deals with or the globe deals with. It feels like, it's time to take a step back and be a little bit more honest. There was this, I read something of yours a while back when I was preparing for the podcast, and you were talking about how there are all these existential questions out there, and that there are some people who are seeking for them, but then there are like the answers to those questions. But there are other people who just want to say things like, we don't need to think about that. We don't need to talk about that. We don't need to bring up the past. And those are things that I experience in my own family, just trying to get everybody to a point where we have genuine relationships, which I think requires a little bit of honesty. But that idea of like, we don't need to talk about that. The very fact that you are talking about it, I think is fantastic. And this is just a little side note, I guess, but this whole thing with the internet and the ability to self-publish, it's fantastic in a sense that you really can avoid the gatekeepers whose job it is to keep you quiet. And it's a weird time to be alive, because it's painful in the sense that we get to be aware of all these things, but then, we have the tools to communicate, I guess, about them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a really cool time to be alive, and also a very overwhelming one too. But I do believe that kind of the age of like the empty influencer is going away. People are kind of tired of the paid posts, the fakery, and the cream is rising to the top. And when I refer to the cream, I mean like people who they have a story to tell. They have the ability now to tell it. And it's almost like a decentralization of power in a sense where, it's like, I love the idea that if, I want to do knitting, I can find a knitting podcast. If I want to, hear about nervous system health, my friend Elizabeth and her friend Jennifer host a podcast called Trauma Rewired. And it's like, they talk all about that. And so I just am such a fan of the decentralization of information and people being able to like niche down and really get nerdy about their specialty and talk about it. And if you're good, and if you approach these topics in a way that resonates with people, they will find you. All you have to do is just continue to be consistent with it. Because for me, I've never invested any money in marketing. I'm a one-woman operation. I don't, I have resisted getting on TikTok or anything. I picked Instagram as the one social media platform that I would try to attack. And then I just focused on my podcast. And over time, it works. I was able to go full time with it last year. But as long as you just believe in something, and I'm on a search, so even it wouldn't matter if no one was listening, I'd still be making this content because I'm on a mission to like learn about myself. And like you said, talk about these things that I don't think enough people are talking about. We hear all the time about narcissistic abuse recovery and, recovering from more overt things like physical abuse or abusive relationships, and it's always focused around these labels. I escaped my borderline ex or whatever, but we don't want to talk about the more nuanced things like emotional neglect and generational trauma, and how these things, and how we turn into pretty shitty people too. And we are much more likely to be pointing our finger at my narcissistic ex, but it's like, but you're in a relationship with the quote unquote narcissistic ex, and all your exes happen to be like that. So why? Right. And it's like, why do you find yourself in these patterns? That's what I'm interested in. I wanted to I say on the podcast, like I was sick enough of my own bullshit to start like asking these questions. Does that excuse any of the behavior of, the people who did, like I was a victim of sexual assault, and grooming and all of these horrible things, right? But my inability to look at the impact on that and how I was holding that in my body actually made it to where the good, secure partners that I found myself with were scared to talk about their feelings to me because I was so reactive and traumatized. I had issues with intimacy because of all these things. But if all I did was spend my time pointing outward, finding issues with people, I wouldn't be where I am now. I had to start like turning it around and figuring out what I could do to change what's going on in here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said. There's this tendency today there's like almost like a pride in this idea of being an activist, or like there's this need to be an activist. You've got to be an activist because the world's so messed up. But I think what you're saying is so on point that going all the way back to what you're saying about social media, I think there is this shift of people just getting to a point where they're tired with projecting outward. They're just tired of blaming the world, and they just want to, stop putting out all of these pieces that are inflammatory, that are victim like labeling, and this idea of what you're saying, where you just at some point you want to just get in control, be in control of your own self. And you start to notice how the emotions going through your body, they're not necessarily changing, but your relationship to them changes. And then you can stop putting everything out there. There's this great movie. It's one of my favorite movies. And I don't think it's that well known. It's kind of a cult classic from maybe the 90s, but it's got Tom Hanks. It's called The Burbs. And
I've never seen it.
Oh, it's so funny. It's just this really dumb movie about like this group of neighbors in a cul-de-sac, and then these creepy neighbors move in and they all become suspicious. And the movie escalates to the point where their neighbors are gone for the day, so they're like in their house digging up their basement, like looking for dead bodies in their neighbor's house. Anyways, end of the movie, the police are there. There's a huge, mess, and Tom Hanks is yelling at his neighbor, and he says to him, he goes, it's not them, it's us. And he's like, it's the end of the movie, catastrophe and everything, and he's finally able to turn it around and look inward and go, oh, they're not the crazy ones, we are. That just feels like the message for the day, the message for
it's a metaphor of our times, right?
right It's not them, it's us.
Yeah, it's true. And the irony is that you actually can't make any kind of meaningful change. You can't be an activist at all, making any kind of forward progress unless you have the ability to like look. Critical thinking means you have to be critical of your own thinking, right? We have a massive deficit of critical thinking. And I think a lot of people are much more interested in virtue signaling and, being seen to be parroting back the right talking points. Whereas I'm not going to put anyone on blast, but the other day I met like a creator, and I kind of asked them, they talk a lot about spiritual topics. And I just said like, what's your favorite thing in spirituality? And they were kind of like, I don't really, research that stuff as much. It just performs well on social media. Right. And I was just like, man, and I think that's the problem, right? You see a lot of people. I think it's fantastic, a lot of the activism that's going on, because I couldn't agree more. I think it's devastating what's happening in the world. But the thing is that if you scratch the surface of what some of these people are saying, they couldn't tell you about exactly why they're advocating for the causes that they are. And also they're so reactionary and unable to have nuanced, complex conversations. And it's so easy to say, tear it all down, but what's harder is to sit at the table with people that think differently than you, listen to their opinion, understand how you might be projecting, how you might be being overreactive. And it scares me, quite frankly, to see where we're going with our online behavior, because it's also just so easy to dehumanize each other. And I think especially with young people, they spend less and less time actually just engaging in the real world, that they're forgetting that actually the average everyday person is usually just a pretty nice person doing the best that they can. Like sometimes I actually go out and I forget, like I'm on a walk and people are just waving and I'm like, people are actually pretty just, they're in general nice. They're just trying to get by. And also, some people are struggling with their mental health. And so I find it really difficult too when people attack each other. It's like you're not parroting back the right activist talking points. And it's like some people are just trying to wake up and get through the day, and having the pressure of having to save the world on your little shoulders and seeing everything that's going wrong in the world at all times, especially for these young people. I remember what it felt like at 11 years old just to watch 9/11 happen, and that was just, I didn't even have social media. I was so overwhelmed and traumatized by seeing my parents not even know what to tell me. And so it's like, I can't even fathom what young people that go online and see all of this stuff that are big-hearted, empathetic people that want to help. Because I just remember feeling paralyzed as a young girl, of how sad it was to watch the hatred happening in the world. And so I have a lot of empathy, number one, for the young people that are doing this. They're just guinea pigs in this weird social experiment with social media. And then that's why I think it's ironic when older generations say, what's wrong with them? And I'm going, look at this weird petri dish that all of you created for them to live in. And you're going to say that they're the messed up generation. Anyway, I could go on, but it's scary to watch, but also fascinating to watch as someone who's interested in these things. And, but I'm an optimist. I always say that from chaos and disorder often comes a lot of clarity. And I believe in the power of good. I believe that, we'll make our way out of this, but right now it's a strange and scary time culturally.
Yeah, it is. It's very strange. It's very scary. At the same time, I think I probably agree with you as far as being an optimist.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I think it's probably important, especially for young people to wrap their heads around for today, right now, 2024, is that we are not at the end of history. We're we're right in the middle of it. History never ends. There's this sense that time is linear, and you can look back and you can say, oh, those were the Romans and those were the British Empire and those were the Nazis. And then here we are. And we've got these different groups, different factions. Mm-hmm. There's this sense that everything should be solved by now. Everything should be peace. And this idea that science or modernity or something should have already pushed the genetic programming out of us that makes us compete and make us jealous and make us fight each other. Mm-hmm. But the truth is that we're just right in the middle of it. And there's, the other thing that I see is a lot of people thinking or behaving as if things have always been this way. Meaning the social structure, the technology, the economy, education, even just this idea of what we now call privilege. So many ideas of things that used to be blessings are now privilege. And so there's a lot of shame around it. And I don't know. I think people need to make their bed, and people need to, there's just this sense that we are somebody in the future, whoever our children, our grandchildren are going to be, we're their history. And so we've got to realize we're not at the end of it, but we're right in the middle of it. And so there seems to be this call for our generation to be a little bit more proactive, a little bit more taking some of this information that we've gained and turning it into something beneficial. Which actually, this kind of gets us to a topic that I wanted to talk about. And this is probably the thing I wanted to talk to you about the most. Is you have this idea of symptoms as saviors. And it's something that, it's something that I love, and I can see it so clearly now. I'm a big reader of Carl Jung and kind of that Jungian school of psychology and thought. And so you don't see it a lot in the mainstream, where it's really about labels and diagnosis and pills. And but I would love to hear your thoughts on this idea of symptoms as saviors. And even I've heard your TED talk, and if you want to share a little bit about your personal story in coming to this, I think that's a really interesting topic. So I'll just give you the floor.
Sure.
for
I
that.
want to clarify for listeners, unless they go searching. I've never done a TED Talk per se, but
Sorry. Okay.
it's okay. I just want to make sure, because I'm like, if some of your listeners are like, where is that? I'm like, I haven't done it. I'd love to one day. It'd be a great topic for me to do it on. But I have spoken. I did do like a plenary speech at the University of Calgary's PhD symposium. They invited me to talk about this. And I am incredibly, incredibly passionate about it. I'm far from the first person to say, to see symptoms as some kind of signal, like to move through a destructive underworld time. It's very Jungian. It's very depth psychology, and just as that's why Carl Jung getting so much flack of saying that he's like culturally appropriated or he's hijacked things. It's like, some of these ideas have so much life, and there's a reason why some of the same ideas rise up throughout different cultures throughout time. Nobody owns these concepts. They're so timeless. And the person who really inspired this thinking in me, her name is Dr. Lisa Miller. I interviewed her on the podcast, and she talks about in her work, she calls depression a knock at the door, right? Which is, again, kind of how I started thinking about symptoms as saviors. And the reason why I was really inspired about that is because Carl Jung and other people I admire very much, like Dr. Joseph Campbell, talk about the resurrection myth and how there's all these different Christ myths. There's Jesus, and then there's Osiris. And, because Jesus is not the first figure to appear in myth and mysticism, who is like this resurrected person who goes through death and rebirth. I became very fascinated with the allegorical nature of some of these things. And when I was caught in the mires of the biomedical model of mental health, which tries to help people, and again, people who practice under this model, vast majority of these people have the best intentions. They want to help people. It's not like there's some secret shady rooms. It's just the fact that we have really messed up incentive structures, and this model has been clunking along for so long. But once I started kind of getting like red pilled, as it were, with psychiatry, and realizing that there is zero scientific evidence for the existence of any of the diagnostic labels, that includes ADHD, that includes, we've been told for decades that there is some kind of chemical imbalance in the brain that leads to various different disorder and dysfunction labels. We've been told that personalities can be disordered, and that if you have NPD or BPD, it's incurable, right? And when in reality, it's very common knowledge that, common knowledge in certain circles, but tragically in the collective, this is still not known that it's a myth. There's never been any kind of scientific proof for any of that. It's all just speculation from white coats. And quite frankly, psychiatrists only have carry any kind of weight because they go to medical school, when in reality, their entire, the basis for their entire profession is kind of pseudoscientific. And so once I started really understanding that, then I started going, why am I looking at myself as someone who has kind of a mental illness or a disorder or dysfunction? I got into the work of people like Carl Jung, who talk about, understanding your unconscious and also seeing your life through this like mythopoetic lens, through this like narrative lens. And I realized that, my life was a story, and that my suffering had a purpose, and that I could use moving through that suffering to help other people, and that I was constantly dynamically changing. And that actually aligns with epigenetics and actual neuroscience and neuroplasticity. And so I just realized, like, this is so wrong, right? Why do we have so many people still believing? There's a Times article that came out not too long ago saying we've reached peak therapy. Like, we have more access to therapy than ever before. We have more diagnostic labels than ever before. More awareness, quote unquote, less stigma around mental health. So why are we still so sick? Why are mental health outcomes plummeting, right? And I believe there's a lot more to that. Like, just fucking look at the world. Sorry, excuse my language. I don't know if I can curse on this podcast.
Cursing is fine. No, okay. You can curse, yeah.
But look at the state of the world, right? So we can't just blame it on one thing. But it's a hell of a lot easier to say, hey, here's your disorder label, here's your meds, or go to DBT therapy and get yourself under control and make yourself more palatable for the people around you, which is great. But also, like, let's not talk about your sexual assault. Let's not talk about the systemic nature of some of this stuff. Like, you know, the Kendrick and Drake stuff where they're talking about underage girls being groomed and all of these things, right? This is an epidemic, but we don't want to talk about those bigger things because that's really hard to fix. Nobody wants to redo the whole homework. So it's a lot easier. So quite frankly, not only does the biomedical model make a lot of money, because the DSM, every time a new edition comes out, it makes all therapists have to buy this $500 new book. So imagine how much money they make. And they have to keep adding more so it changes, right? So that you have to buy a new one. And then giving people labels means better insurance, money, giving them medication. You know, it's a business now. As they say, a patient cured is a customer lost, right? So it's a business with no scientific basis. And to me, it's like horrifying that the average everyday person, when I tell them that I do a mental health podcast, one of the first things they do is like, oh yeah, my so-and-so has borderline personality disorder, or, oh, my sister's friend's cousin has bipolar. Yeah, thank God he's on his meds, right? These are the first things that come out of people's mouth. I don't tell them, you know, that I'm like red pilled against psychiatry. I just kind of listen. But that's the cultural collective. That's what's in the collective conscious. So even if psychiatrists, which any psychiatrist worth their salt, if you tell them what I'm saying, they're like, of course, we've said this for decades now that the serotonin hypothesis is a myth. It's like, yeah, but why did I just go to one of my prenatal checkup appointments the other day, and in the office of one of the doctor's offices, not my OB, but I just see a huge antidepressant board, and it's just like, take this, imbalance this, that. And I'm like, it's a myth that's being perpetuated. So to tie this all up with a nice bow, symptoms as saviors for me, once I started seeing my symptoms as alerts, I say on the podcast that your symptoms are like alerts from your body, mind, and spirit that want to let you know when you're out of alignment with the deepest yearnings of your soul. I say that. And I say from chaos comes clarity, right? If we can see, oh, you know, it's just this, like, if I can know that my jaw is tense, I'm like, why is my jaw tense? Maybe I'm stressing out. Maybe I need to relax. You know, if I'm having an anxious thought, I'm going, why am I feeling that way? Let me think about it, instead of let me push it away and like hit my weed pen, which is like what I might have done before, right? Too many people are suppressing these things instead of seeing even little tensions in your body, even little like periodic depression. Does that mean that you're burning yourself out, right? Does that mean that you need to go and like take some time in nature? We've lost the art of being able to know that our symptoms in our bodies are actually our biggest allies, you know, and instead we've chosen to suppress and numb and pathologize the human experience. And it's clearly not helping anything, because again, if that was, we would be seeing better outcomes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. With a ton of stuff that you just said there, even all the way down to the weed pen.
There was a lot.
Yeah, but even all the way down to the weed pen, I'm like, oh yeah, I agree with what you're saying, because that's even in my life now, like that's a response that helps in the moment.
Don't get me
right?
wrong. I still love my marijuana, right? Like I'm pregnant now. So this is like the most sober I've been. It's actually really nice little detox, you know, but I have a medical card. I have like some tincture every once in a while. And don't get me wrong. Like I have not evolved past all of these things. I still have the need to kind of like, I run very high anxiety. And so having like something like that, it's just, I love it. It's a hell of a lot easier than sitting with it.
Yeah, it is. And oh God, you could be so much more productive. But going all the way back, I just love the way that you talk, because we'd already mentioned Carl Jung, but then you bring up Joseph Campbell, and I've got a stack of Joseph Campbell books this big that I've read.
Yeah, me too.
Because it ties into what you're talking about with myth. Like right now, there's this myth of how mental health works. And the thing about myth is we like to talk, a lot of people think about myth as either being absolutely true or being a complete lie. Like that's what myth means. It's absolutely true or it's a lie. But the thing is that myth, Joseph Campbell, myth is just the stories that we organize our lives based on. And that's what's happening with this model of mental health, is that it's become unstigmatized. It's become accepted. It's become normal because it's like the modern myth of our psyches, or what we are, how we connect with the world. The challenge with it is that, there are people at the very top who have perverse incentives, but then people like you and me, when you first get to that point when you go, oh, something's so off that I need to talk to somebody about it. Like I need to find somebody who's an expert who can help me. And for me at that stage, I was thinking in my head, I'm like, I need a label, I need a diagnosis, because then I know how to solve it. If I have a label, if I have a diagnosis, then I will have mitigating activities. I'll have, some tools that I can put in my tool chest so that when these things, so there's this whole misconception around the labeling and the diagnosis versus actually getting to the root of what your challenge is and what you're dealing with, right? And from a Joseph Campbell perspective, that would be like the call to initiation, the call to adventure. Mm-hmm. And so the depression, the borderline personality disorder, the ADHD, whatever it is, that thing is actually the messenger. And it's just there to say, hey, it's time for that journey, right?
That's right. But most people don't want to. He calls it like the call. It's like that first step of the hero's journey process. And every myth follows that. That's why if people aren't even religious or whatever, they love Star Wars or they love Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. I could go on. So many reluctant hero, right? Who's tortured, goes through a lot of trauma. Just look at Harry Potter. When he gets his Hogwarts letter, right? He finds out that he has this destiny and only he can kill Lord Voldemort, right? Luke Skywalker, same. Frodo, same. All of these like characters. And I'm working with a Jungian now, which was like a dream I had. I thank God I found she came into my life in a very, it was a moment of synchronicity. And thankfully she works on like a massive sliding scale basis with me, because as listeners of yours that might know, if they've ever tried to seek out Jungian analysis, which again is like very niche, I guess. I wish it wasn't. Rarely do they offer insurance because they don't believe in that whole model, right? And if you're going to offer insurance, a lot of times you have to diagnose people. And there are very good reasons. I've interviewed a lot of therapists over the years, and I know that if you seek out mental health, a lot of times you find the therapists that are really good, and almost it's like the better they are, the less likely they are to take insurance. And then they charge these really high hourly rates. And interestingly, I used to really scoff at that. I used to say, oh, like so elitist, so gross. But in reality, a lot of them have really good reasons for not wanting to buy into that whole model. They want to be outside. But unfortunately, that's what happens, right? So you either have people that are fully bought in, or the therapists that I talk to that reluctantly go along with it, but behind the scenes will tell me, thank God for your podcast. I give my patients your podcast. I have to play along with this model that I don't even believe in. But see, like, this is what it causes. It causes this like weird systemic rot. But I'm working with this Jungian, and one of the things she told me to do was look at different myths throughout time and fairy tales, and try to find a fairy tale that matched like my upbringing as closely as possible, and kind of see myself in that and kind of rewrite my own fairy tale with using kind of that hero's journey archetype, or rather framework, rather like to explore that. And these kinds of things are free to do. Yeah. And it's why I find it to be so deeply disappointing that this information isn't more readily given to like kids, right? Like letting kids start seeing their lives this way. I feel like so many less people would find themselves into patterns of like suicidal ideation if they saw their life as this massive journey, that there are cycles, understanding the benefit of like the underworld process, and knowing that like these deep moments of suffering can be like your greatest times of growth. But because they think I'm mentally ill. There's something wrong with me. It's never going to get better. And they don't have these larger frameworks. That's why, I say on the podcast all the time, we're a society that's like devoid of myth and meaning. Like young people used to have initiatory experiences. They used to go through, they used to have the medicine man to go to and hear these stories that would tie them to something bigger. We don't have that anymore. We just have the Twitter trending page. It's going to show you every messed up thing that's happening ever, or going on and seeing like crazy hardcore pornography when you're a young person. It's just like, it's so sad to think of like what our younger generations are missing out on. Even our generations, like for me, I had to go seeking that stuff out, and it's so hard to find, and it's so niche. And it makes me sad that it's so niche. I wish that it was more readily available, and I wish I wasn't looked at like such a kind of like a weirdo with like this weird niche passion, when I truly believe that my niche passion might actually really be the thing that could help a lot of people. But maybe that's me being like egocentric, but I feel like it's like an answer collectively that we need. I genuinely feel that way.
But would you feel that way if it hadn't helped you? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like if you hadn't experienced it and found, oh, there's some connection here, like nature, spirituality, like, oh, I am multitudes and I can negotiate those multitudes. If you hadn't found that yourself, there wouldn't be that impetus to then turn around and share it.
That's true. But one thing that I tell my listeners, and I've found this to be very true, is that even if throughout listening to my podcast, listeners, if they hear something that I've said that sort of goes, like that kind of resonates, but maybe not all the way, I encourage them to follow their own breadcrumbs. So for example, like I have book lists on Amazon that have hundreds of books on there. And I tell my listeners, like, go look at my book list. And if you see one book that looks interesting, don't even get that book. Go to their recommended books and like take yourself down a rabbit hole, right? Like there are far too many people, especially members of my millennial generation, that are positioning themselves as these like weird coaching gurus, saying like, come take my program and all this stuff. I have like resisted doing that. So many people I know is like, why don't you do a program? I'm like, no, I want to stay as far away from that as possible, because my whole thing is telling people to follow their own path, right? And I would love it if something that I could say could just like awaken like a tiny little spark where they then trust themselves enough to kind of go down and follow their own breadcrumbs in their little Alice in Wonderland journey, because it's only through that you can find what means something to you, because meaning to me is going to mean something completely different for someone else. But I still believe that finding your fairy tale, finding your narrative, finding what it means to you to feel like you are a patchwork in the quilt of something bigger than yourself. And there are thousands of ways to do that. And the problem is that we've been giving people these very boring, boxed in prescriptions of what that looks like, including new age, including religion, including psychiatry. There's too many little prescriptions. No, free yourself from all of that and say I have a pick and mix bag of spirituality. Like I love a little bit of everything, but I've had to go outside the box and collect those pieces. Too many people just want it to be served up on a silver platter. What do you want me to do? Tell me what to do. It doesn't work like that.
100% agree. 100%. Have you read Carl Jung's Red Book?
Yeah, I have it, but I think if anyone who's read the Red Book from cover to cover, I have a hell of a lot of respect for. So touche if you have. I've dabbled.
The Red Book.
It's heavy.
It's heavy. It was like reading something that scared me.
I was about to say, like, you have to like really be in a good psychological place to read the Red Book, because he's basically never intended for that to be released. It was like a depth. He was like going through a psychosis, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. He was putting himself through it intentionally to try to figure it out. And the reason I bring it up is just because of what you're talking about, as far as everybody needs to find their own path to healing, health, maturation, growth, individuation, whatever. I think all those words are synonymous, but it's a path that everybody's got to find on their own. The way I think about it, since you like to think about stories and myth, It's the way I think about it is the entire human species is doing what you and I are trying to do. It's just going about it at a much slower pace because it's this huge entity, right? But at first we came up with these ideas based on our environment, and we had this worship of the mother goddess and these pantheons of gods. And it was like accepted that there are different parts of us inside of us. And sometimes those different parts take the lead.
Yeah.
And then just through history, we moved into this monotheistic mindset where there's one God, which means that there should only be one part of us that's in control all the time. And so in essence, it was like an identification with the ego rather than with the whole self. The thing that you're describing, though, is this religious behavior of like everybody trying to do it the same way, everybody trying to worship or grow, or from a mythical perspective, everybody trying to achieve their wholeness or some level of consciousness.
Yeah.
And in the past, it's always been the group. It's always been the group path where, the most modern Western example of that is the monotheistic religions in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And it's very it can become very fundamental that whatever the founder of the religion experienced, everybody's supposed to have that same experience. The thing with the Red Book and what Carl Jung is trying to show us is that, because you talked about allegory earlier and how stories jump out to you as allegorical, which is great because very few fairy tales or myths or even scripture is supposed to be taken literally. When you take things literally, you fall into this very narrow mindset where everybody's supposed to be doing the same thing. But the thing with with religion or myth is that it's supposed to take us from one stage of our existence to another. And what monotheism did was it created we were all worshiping a single God, which meant that there's like God is an individual and he's everything. And so over the last 2,000, 4,000 years, however long it's been since we've narrowed down to like Yahweh and Jesus and very monotheistic, we've all been worshiping an individual to the point where worship is emulation. So we've all been emulating an individual to the point where we all became individuals. And so then you don't need, once a myth has reached its purpose, you no longer need that myth. And so we're waiting for this next myth to emerge. What's the next story that's going to take us forward? And I think it's exactly what you're saying. Once the entire society becomes individuals, then it would literally be impossible for us all to be following the same prescribed path because we're individuals. And so this is like the evolution of the entity where the human entity, where we are at a point where we all need to recognize that we all have our own paths. And by all of us being on our own paths, we're essentially following the same path. Which that's like in the way that I see it, in the way that I think Carl Jung was writing it in the Red Book, is this idea that we need to die to the old story. We need to sacrifice ourselves to our old story, and we all need to go find our own path. And from a modern perspective, what that looks like to me is creativity, art. What you're doing with your podcast and your writing, what I'm doing with my writing, my podcast, people making music, people making movies, people putting their whole selves into building things. And I think that act of creation is how all of us as individuals are going to create ourselves, which is that healing individuation process.
I agree with that. And I mean, that's why, if everybody followed exactly what I was doing, where would we be, right? We need someone who follows their crazy manic path of painter. We need someone to follow my crazy manic path of what I'm doing and what you're doing, right? And like that explores all of it and contributes to this collective growth. And that's the problem with these very prescriptive things. And also this myth that I talk about recently of, everything across the board, from the biomedical model of mental health to the average everyday new age guru person online, saying that if only you do XYZ, then you'll be restored to like who you would have been without your trauma, right? I call it this like mystical state of pre-trauma purity, or you'll be cured, or something like that, right? Whereas what would we all be if we never experienced any kind of adversity? We would just be these like boring little blobs floating around with no story. And my pain tells a story that I've only been able to like understand the benefit. Benefit isn't the right word. The like, it made me into someone who can speak compellingly to the things that I believe I'm meant to be speaking about. Now, the average the person next to me has a whole other path that they're meant to follow. But if I tell them, do exactly what I did, this thing that liberated me would constrict them because they're not following their thing, right? So the same framework can apply, the hero's journey, but there's a reason why Harry Potter story looks like that. Frodo's story looks like that, right? Mollie's story looks like this. Like the framework is great. And I think that's the collective. That's like what, you're talking about, these archetypes. The gods were these archetypes. You're possessed by a certain archetype, right? All of us have all of these different archetypes within us, but and that collective aspect, this aspect that we can all relate to as humans, is very important, and it can guide someone's life while they still have their whole unique path that looks very different to mine. And it's doing what Marion Woodman says. It's like you have to hold the tension of the opposites, right? Like that can be true, and this can also be true, right? And that's why when I don't respond to listener emails, really. I stopped doing that a long time ago because I realized it's not appropriate for me to get involved in someone's journey. They want to ask me advice and stuff like that, but I don't know anything about them. I could actually do a lot more harm than good responding to their middle of the night panic-stricken email asking me for advice where they're in the worst, most triggered state possible, saying they have a horrible boyfriend, when in reality, I know that like I've said my boyfriend's the worst person in the world when he's like asking me something very balanced. So I'm going to be giving this person advice from their most triggered state. It's the worst thing I could do. And also they are outsourcing their free will and their power and their growth to me. And I am stepping in as this all-knowing figure that can like give them advice. And the highest form of love I can offer my listeners is to not do that. And just continue to say on my podcast why I don't listen, I don't read, or I don't respond to these emails is because I'll share with you what's working for me. And what's working for me is following my path, falling on my face when I need to, recognizing where I need to like sit with and not have someone swoop in and save me, and figuring it out on my own. And so, yeah, I hope that sort of adds, I don't really have a clean way to wrap that up, but I feel like there's a balance to be found in seeing yourself in these bigger stories. Like I think the hero's journey is a really good example, that framework that could work for everyone. Like I could give that to anyone. And I could confidently say, if you look at this and put it into context in your own life, in your own unique way, I believe confidently that that could help every person on planet Earth. Why? Because it is a freaking monomyth. That's why. It's because it relates to everyone on Earth. It's the human experience. It's finding meaning in your suffering. It's seeing your symptoms as saviors, what have you. But the way you approach your hero's journey, that's where you can't outsource that to someone else. You can't copy someone else's playbook. Otherwise, you're going to end up with your symptoms. Why? Because they're telling you, you're trying to copy someone else's playbook. Hello, we're going to mess up your life until you figure that out. And it's helping you. But we're too busy numbing and suppressing them to recognize that.
I appreciate you not presenting yourself as a guru. Not presenting, like not putting out workshops, trying to like guide people. It's so much more valuable and honest the way that you've approached it, to just put yourself out there and say, hey, in essence, you're just saying, hey, this is my story. I can see why my story is similar to, Frodo Baggins. And so maybe that'll help you see why your story is as well. But what I was trying to say, the challenge is that Frodo Baggins is saving the world, right? Or what do they call it? Middle Earth. Frodo Baggins is saving Middle Earth. Harry Potter is saving the entire magical world. Luke Skywalker is saving the galaxy. And so it can be really challenging to look at these large stories and see how like you and your relationship with your mom is has the same level of weight as, you know, as Frodo carrying that ring to Mordor. And so that it's just that our personal lives can feel so small compared to the grandeur of these stories. And so how do you extrapolate? I mean, it's something that just, especially like, I think it always came natural for me to associate with stories. And especially since I've read more Jung, more Joseph Campbell, even just listening to modern people like Jordan Peterson give lectures, it's like, oh, like I can see how I connect. Like I can see how I'm Pinocchio and how I need to become a real boy. And that these are the struggles that I'm going to go through. But I think that from maybe said another way, for people who are a little bit more extroverted and they don't turn inward so much, it may be challenging to connect that grand story to themselves.
Yeah, I could see that. You know, interestingly, I don't know if I agreed fully. I think it might be harder for them to create the time to get inward enough to see it. But if they do, and the thing is, no matter what, if you get to a point where you're low enough in your mental health, you're open to these things, because extrovert or introvert, you will find yourself in a rock bottom moment where you are forced to kind of like look at this stuff. But I also think that, you know, these monomyths and these big stories, obviously they're meant to relate to the largest amount of people at once. But if you see yourself in relation to the example of, you know, healing your relationship with your mother, right? I know firsthand that a really broken relationship with your mom can turn you into a person who is really difficult to be around at work, to be around as a partner, to be around. Probably, I don't have firsthand experience of this, but definitely as a parent, you know, speaking from someone who has a partner, who has a mother, who has a really broken relationship with her mother, that impacted my husband deeply, his mom's unresolved issues with her mom. And if you can heal that one thing in yourself, you are healing your children's generation, you're healing your whole lineage. You are doing just as monumental a thing as Frodo is doing, you know, in his monomyth. But you have to be able to have the depth and breadth of awareness to see it in that way, you know? But again, it's kind of what we were talking about full circle at the beginning, where everyone thinks they have to save the world, when in reality, again, I am far from the first person to say this. Jordan Peterson even says, like, make your own bed, you know, like you have to start. And again, he is not the first person to say stuff like that. Start with yourself, right? You're not going to be any kind of activist. You're not going to make any kind of Frodo Baggins impact on the world if you can't clean up your own stuff first. And even if you stop at healing your own lineage, like that's huge, you know? And if everyone on earth would do that, think about it. If everyone on earth would clean up their relationship with their mommy or daddy issues, would they not be a better partner and parent? Would that not echo down throughout the entire generations of people, healing generations of young people who would then be healed and then healed and then healed? That means we all have to do this seemingly small thing that has a huge impact on the collective. But people don't want to do that. They'd rather spend their time virtue signaling about the currently trending topic, when in reality, they could make a whole lot more impact if they did that seemingly small thing, which is actually not small at all.
Yeah, agreed. Imagine if everybody could, it's not even, I think maybe you get to a point where it's not even like, imagine if everybody could grow up in a loving home, but it's more like, imagine if everybody could integrate the pain that they've experienced.
Yeah. And realize not blaming, free themselves from blame and shame, free their parents from blame and shame, accept and move on. It doesn't mean you're condoning what happened to you, but you're not letting it run your life anymore, right? Because far too many of us are adults who are little kids walking around in adult bodies that are just triggered. We're literally reacting to our partners about shit that's not even have to do with them. It has to do with our own stuff. And if everybody just cleaned up that subconscious rot that's going on, then they would be moving in the world in a much healthier and integrated way. And they would then, that in itself, you hear new age people saying like elevating the collective consciousness, like that would literally do that in the most objective way. And if everybody was a little less triggered and a little less taking stuff personally and a little more wanting to own their own shit and not blame and project, how much change could we make? We could actually make change. And also, half the change wouldn't even have to be made because people would just be better, more integrated people, and they wouldn't keep making decisions that would hurt other people. Maybe wouldn't have all these screwed up incentive structures and on and on and on. So it's like these ironic, like quote unquote, tiny individual changes are the only things that create collective change.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I see earlier I was talking about the human species as like this entity. And what I think, or as how I see things, is psychology is such that whether you're talking about the individual psychology, or the group psychology, the collective, all the way up to the entire species, it really does seem as if it all works the same way. It's as if these stories get into us and then we play them out. And through the playing out of these stories, we either learn something and we grow, or we just ingrain ourselves further into the stories. And the only way for the entire collective to break away from that story pattern is for each of us, one by one, as individuals, to break away from it. And
precisely.
And then we stop projecting everything outward. We pull everything inward, and then we become these people who, it's interesting because you don't, as a child, I grew up in a very religious setting. And so as a child, to me, like, being an adult meant that you achieve this place where your desires are like one with God. Your behavior is such that you're not hurting anybody else. But it took me a long time to realize that even the goal of life isn't necessarily happiness. Like, you're not going to feel happy all the time just because you're conscious. But what you can do is you can start to feel more whole. You start to feel like more like yourself, more complete, less influenced by the outer world, less angry at the outer world. Once you grieve for reality, it's much more difficult to be angry at it because you've already processed a lot of that feeling. And then, you're in that place of, like acceptance, whether it's the Buddhist version of accepting things as they really are, or just being a grown-up and just not letting any little idea, story, emotion get you to run away from, a responsible path, I guess.
Well said. Yeah, I agree.
We're like 3 minutes away from our hour. And so I want to, there's actually like two things, just really random. But there's one is going back to the very beginning, to like you started this podcast, you called it Back from the Borderline. Ironically enough, it was the borderline stuff that I first connected with because I had never been diagnosed borderline, but reading the symptoms, going on Reddit threads, I was just like, oh my God, this is
a common story.
Yeah, this is like, this is what I feel. This is what I experience. All the way down to this idea of the favorite person and how I navigated my entire life, always having some favorite person. So what is, maybe I don't even have a question there. Just circling.
I think I know where you're going with it. It's the irony, the fact that most of my long-term listeners have found me because of borderline personality disorder, and then how I've come full circle and think it's just like the most like useless diagnosis ever. I mean, even people in the United Kingdom, they call it the dustbin diagnosis because they think that it's just kind of where people end up when psychiatrists don't know what to do with you. They're just like, yeah, I think they're borderline, But the fact remains, and I talked a lot about this in a Substack post that I actually was just like reading off on my podcast yesterday. And it's just because the symptoms, quote unquote, symptoms of what is known as borderline personality disorder are so universally relatable. Like, I think if anybody goes and reads off those symptoms and just like didn't associate it with BPD, but they think like unstable relationships, right? a tendency towards splitting, which is like, it's called splitting countertransference, which essentially means you tend to see things in a very black and white extreme way, which when you're someone who's dealt with like long-term emotional neglect or any kind of like complex trauma, you're going to be in an activated way. And collectively, are we not societally all splitting, seeing things black and white? Also, like chronic feelings of emptiness is a symptom of BPD. We're all chronically empty. We're all struggling with these things. And yeah, the favorite person concept is not necessarily a symptom of BPD, but it's this weird trending, like BPD jargon that's kind of taken off, when in reality, I'm not sure if you've ever heard the concept of limerence. It's exactly the same thing. Limerence is the favorite person. And limerence is, if you're having limerent feelings, it's essentially finding your entire sense of self in someone else, right? Like when you wrap all of your emotional stability up in another person. And these are concepts that are so universally relatable. But it just so happens that this BPD label put all of these things that our society, in my opinion, is like collectively sick with. And of course, all of that stuff is relatable. And so hence why I was just like you. I literally went to my first psychiatrist and I said, I was like, worst point of my life. And I literally, like a good little girl, did all my homework. And I said, okay, so I have this symptom, this symptom, this symptom. I read it off and I said, I have BPD. Give me the diagnosis. Like that will help me. And he said, you're way too high functioning to have BPD. Meanwhile, I was like suicidal, eating almond butter to survive. Like I was like, I am not high functional. But because I presented in a way that made him think I was functional. And he said, and trust me, you don't want BPD. It's incurable, right? A psychiatrist said this to me just 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm like, what? So he goes, we'll just treat you for bipolar 2 because we can treat that with medication and like, just basically be happy that you don't have BPD. And I'm like, what the hell? So I think so many people find themselves, they see those symptoms and they're like, that's me, right? It's like meme culture. You see a meme and you're like, that's me. Like, oh, I have an answer. Yeah, we all want this diagnosis. Oh, I finally found the problem. But I say that diagnoses are like a training wheels on a bike. Like it's really helpful, but then eventually you're kind of like, this is lame. Like I'm driving around with training wheels. Eventually I need to take these training wheels off, right? Like I want to actually ride my bike. That's how I see diagnostic labels. I think they can be really, really helpful up to a point, but then what can you really do with this list of symptoms if you're not going to get to the root cause? That psychiatrist never asked me what happened to me. He never asked me, we never got to talk about my sexual trauma or why I was suicidal at that time, which was right after I had lost all of my stuff because of that predatory behavior from men in the industry. He might have said, wow, it makes perfect sense why you're feeling this way. You don't have a disordered personality. Like, let's talk about what happened to you. That never happened, you know? So that's why I'm so grateful in a sense that that label exists purely from an SEO perspective so people can find my content. But then thank God they get to my content and I can free them from this misguided belief that they have some kind of disordered personality, because that can only be helpful up to a point. It's only helpful when you're reading the Reddit thread and going, yes, that's so me. And you're like in this little, I call it the circle jerk of sadness. You know, it's like, oh yeah, this is the answer to all my problems. Or people on there that are going, oh, yep, my girlfriend was a crazy borderline bitch, got the answers now. Now I'm going to go off and find myself in the exact same relationship again and call this next girl borderline, right? So I just find this to be a fascinating thing. So back from the borderline, interestingly, it allowed me to reclaim that word, because the word borderline has existed far before the invention of that disorder. And everybody, that's why I finish each episode saying like anyone can come back from the borderline. We've all been to the edge, the rock bottom moments, like, and you can come back from that. And it's actually good to get to that edge because you learn a lot, right? So it's like, it's just like what we've talked about. So that's why I never changed the name of my podcast, because it still feels true to what I talk about, even though I don't believe, quote unquote, in that label. I don't find it to be an effective way. But if people find me because they identify with those symptoms, I'm fine with that too, because I do too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a fantastic way to to wrap things up as well.
Yeah.
This idea, I love this idea that it's that the label is almost like training wheels. It gets you started.
Yeah.
But just like riding a bike, at some point you got to get rid of the training wheels and just grow up and just ride a bike. Yeah.
Yeah. There's my favorite phrase from this Polish philosopher, and I can't remember what his name is. It's escaping me now, but he says the map is not the territory, right?
Oh,
so and that's how I view diagnostic labels as well. Sure, they can be a great map, but if you're like walking around, I don't know, Yellowstone National Park, I'm from Wyoming, you're just like looking at the map, like look up, like look at the beautiful mountains, right? The map can help you get around. But if you are too stuck in it, you're going to miss the off the beaten path, like what you could find if you go outside the constraints of that map. So it's only useful to a point.
Absolutely. Yeah. The map is never the terrain. That's something I've had to learn to live by. Tough. I've got this closing quote from Marie-Louise von Franz, who was
one of my faves.
Yeah, studied with Jung. She said, neurosis in a way is a positive symptom. It shows that something wants to grow. It shows that the person is not right in his or her present state. And if growth is not accepted, then it grows against you and produces what might be called a negative individuation. So I think what you're talking about is just take that symptom and turn it into a positive individuation, integrate it and become who you're supposed to be.
Yeah. Use it as a seed, to plant, and also find out what's the story behind it and what's it telling you. That because there's always a message behind the symptom, so what's the story behind it, and how can that story save you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mollie. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate you coming on here. I appreciate your podcast and all of your vulnerability. And I appreciate your resistance to that narcissistic trend of wanting to be a guru, and just being honest and putting yourself out there. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If people want to listen to your podcast, if they want to find your website, where should they go to find you?
Easiest thing to do is go to backfromtheborderline.com. It's just my link tree. I don't have like a classic website, but backfromtheborderline.com will take you to, you can follow me on Instagram from there. You can subscribe to my Substack, which I put out. I never spam. I just put out one monthly article a month. I put out podcast episodes twice a week, and you can find all of my work on backfromtheborderline.com. And if you want to get new episodes, all you have to do is follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I don't have a YouTube channel. I don't put out video podcasts. I'm a strictly audio girl. So just make sure that you search me on podcast streaming platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and you'll see all of my content. And I have hundreds of episodes that you can dive into.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate this, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you. Bye.